Hi, you're listening to Marking the Role, a podcast for teachers. My name is Phil Dye. This is episode 3. And in episode 2, we looked at what would make teachers stay in the profession. Because like teachers all over the world, teachers in Australia are leaving the profession after about 8 years as the average. So we put out a survey that asked teachers what criteria they would need in order to stay in the profession. Overwhelmingly, number 1 was the reduction of administrative work. Administration seems to be completely burning teachers out, and in today's episode I interview Paul Martin, the CEO of NESA, to answer some of those questions about administration. So admin was number 1. Number 2 was teachers needed stronger behaviour policies that stop the abuse and the disrespect of teachers. This seems to be a big one. It's bigger than salary. So in future weeks, we'll be looking more carefully at behaviour, but we'll be mentioning it today as well, especially the administrative work that's necessary with the behaviour and incident reporting. And the third thing was a salary increase of between 6 and 10%. So that was pretty big, but it wasn't number 1. Okay, so what was the next 2? It gets us down to 5, 4 days a week. Teaching with 1 day of administration. That was favoured amongst the in the survey, and by the way, we had 87 respondents to that survey. And number 5 was less intrusion by educational bureaucracies. There was a lot more as well, but they were the top 5. And if you want to see the exact results of the survey, you can go to filtered.com.au. So that's PHILTERED.com.au. And under the podcast tab, you'll see there's a tab for the results. Regular listeners will know that we have a brain break every 15 minutes. A brain break in teaching gives students a chance to bring their neuron electricity down before they get it up again. Pretty essential. And we've had requests from both weeks for more of the same. More of the same from We Mavericks from episode 1 and from the Water Runners from episode 2. So in order to satisfy both sets of listeners, we'll have one track from each. But before that, I interviewed Paul Martin, the CEO of NESA. And NESA seems to be the source of much of the administrative woe that teachers are experiencing. But before we get into the questions, I asked Paul to just outline his teaching and education background.
Okay, Phil. So I'm currently the CEO of the New South Wales Education Standards Authority. I was working at NESA and its predecessor organisations, BOSTES, the Board of Studies Teaching and Educational Standards, and the Board of Studies, and the New South Wales Institute of Teachers before that, in various roles in relation to policy or strategic policy, the teacher quality areas of professional learning. Prior to that, I worked as a policy advisor for federal and state government ministers. Going right back, I was an English history teacher at a number of high schools in Sydney.
Okay. Paul, our research states that all the criteria they need to stay in the profession is that administrative tasks need to decrease by 50%. That rate's above pay, far above the need for more pay, and is the number 1 with teachers. Do you acknowledge that teachers are suffering from an administrative sort of burnout?
It's certainly been the case that there has been much more public comment about teacher workload and the requirements around administrative burden in the last few years than there were previously. I would acknowledge that. I would say that teachers have always felt that there were tasks that got in the way of their teaching and learning work, but that has reached a much louder volume in the last couple of years.
And that would be possibly because of the greater administrative tasks that are put on them. Would you think that?
I think that in 2022 or 2020 or recently, there are more expectations of teachers to comply with a range of requirements that, in fact, I would say most workers in many fields have to do that. If I think about taking students on an excursion in the 1980s or 90s, there might have been a note, go home, and the teacher takes the students on the excursion, etc. These days, such a process would be 3 or 4 times harder to do and much more involved. I think that's the same with work health and safety requirements out of school. I think there are expectations around programming and planning and assessing and reporting that have become more complex, and therefore that, yes, things have changed in the last little while. Some of it is very important work, though. I mean, it's not as if we can do away with programming and planning and assessing and reporting, but extraneous work certainly should be minimised. We've got to try and get the balance right between work that they need to do and what might be called busy or bureaucratic, and that's not always easy to differentiate.
Some teachers are saying, and one said last week in the podcast, that he was doing so much administrative work he had to go back to teaching from the textbook, as he simply didn't have the time to prepare the motivating stuff like he did 10 years ago. And this was a guy who'd been teaching for 20 plus years. Do you see that could well be a problem, that there's so much administrative work that the motivating and the stimulating stuff that we used to do, that has to slip by in order to just tick these boxes?
Look, I think characterising some of the work as box ticking is probably not necessarily accurate. If I can go to the expectations we have at NESA for a teacher, they have to complete 100 hours of PD over 5 years. That's 20 hours a year. They have always done that. In fact, they do much more than that. So what we ask of them is to tell us the PD they've done of that volume. That's not necessarily a significant amount of work. Other than that, the day-to-day work they do is largely around the nature of the students they're teaching, or the part of the subject that they teach, or perhaps some requirements by employers and employing authorities. But it's not necessarily the case that the workloads of teachers have increased because of the requirements by NESA.
Not data needs, not the requirement for the data as how the student's going. I mean, we used to evaluate twice a year or 3 times a year, but some are saying that there is a consistent need for data which has eclipsed the need for creative teaching.
Well, I think putting up data collection versus creativity or creative teaching is not necessarily accurate anyway. I mean, the assessment of students is at the core of teaching. It's like a doctor's diagnosis. We don't know what to teach unless we know where the student is at in relation to the subject or the content area. Your day-to-day teaching is predicated on 1,000 pieces of assessment, some formal and some informal. Some is walking around the room and noticing that the student has written 2 lines, and others is a formulaic or a test, diagnostic or formative or summative. To suggest that one mitigates against the other is a sort of simplification of both, I would argue. Having said that, I'm not going to deny the major point that's being made there, that teaching has become more complex and there are more demands on a teacher. The point I would go to, though, is what is absolutely necessary for them to be a teacher in a classroom now and do the complex work that they need to do, and what is, as I said earlier, extraneous. But I'd be nervous of suggesting that assessment is not teaching or doesn't have a role or a relationship to teaching.
Yeah, look, I understand it does. It was important when I was teaching too. But it certainly wasn't seemingly the demand for the data that we've got today. Some teachers have reported that over half of their students in a mainstream class, and this is not a special school, not a special class, are on the NCCD list. And you obviously know what that is. In other words, half of the students in the classes are labelled in some ways disabled, and each teacher has to fill out an individual report on a regular basis back to the NCCD for that. Now, is there anything that could be done to relieve this stress? I know that you can't talk on behalf of the NCCD. This, as well as NESA administrative tasks, is really tipping teachers over.
There's a whole range of things there, Phil. Firstly, and I'll go back to the previous point, we don't require teachers to comply or complete data lists. NESA simply asks teachers to maintain their teaching practice as observed by their school and their supervision at their school, and do the 100 hours of PD I mentioned earlier. And once every 5 years someone says, who's a supervisor, that you maintain your proficiency as a teacher. You're still a licensed professional. So the data requirements are often driven by other factors, certainly not by NESA. I'm not saying they're bad or good. I'm just saying that they're not, generally speaking, in NESA's remit. In relation to students with special needs in classrooms, again, the profile of students has changed quite significantly in the last 25 years, and I think we would all support and applaud the fact that students with special needs are integrated into mainstream classes. We don't have the same differentiation as we used to have, where students were not in the same classes as, or some students were not in the same classes as other students. The process of employers and employing authorities or governments identifying what students require additional support does necessarily involve teachers and health professionals making judgments about the effects of the disability on the student performance. And I understand your point, but again, these are not requirements by NESA. These are requirements often by government agencies with the best intent of making sure that individual students are well supported. But I take the point that a classroom teacher walking into a class in 2022 is looking at a different arrangement, a group of students than one might have in the 1960s. But a significant reason for that is the great strides we've made in making sure that every student gets the education they deserve.
Yeah. Look, I spent 3 years working in the disability sector, and I know that it would be great to have some of those individuals I was dealing with in the classroom, but would also be very, very difficult for a teacher to have them in the room, and there is no way that some of those individuals could learn anything in the same way as another student could. Do you acknowledge that causes a problem for teachers?
I again would say that the organisation of classrooms and which students are in which class and the support they get is all a responsibility of the school and the teaching authority, independent, Catholic or government, and each school has different methodologies for constructing and organising classes, though there would be some common elements I would suggest, but you'd have to talk to the authorities about the process of assessing students to get support. What I would say that our standards, the teaching standards, the Australian teaching standards, require teachers to be able to adjust their lessons to meet the range of learners. Mixed ability teaching has been reasonably dominant in Australian and international schools for 50 years probably, and that's always required teachers to not just teach to the middle, but to appropriately attenuate their lessons for the needs of all students. I think the range of students is probably greater because of the issues you've raised in relation to students with disability, but a good professional needs to be able to appropriately deliver so that every student is moving. Having said that, it's a difficult job. I'm never going to underestimate just how hard it is to be a teacher in the modern era. It's very demanding, but the requirement to make sure that every student gets opportunities in the classroom is not only required under various types of legislation. Our teaching standards would say that is at the very core of being a professional. The supports that teachers get for that is a matter between them and their employer. It's a matter of whether your particular school or system or sector provides you with appropriate or additional support. And that's not something that I can talk about. It's generally an industrial matter, or at least it's part of industrial arguments. What we would say, though, is that teachers need to be supported so that they can continue to maintain their professional standards.
And we're going to leave Paul Martin, CEO of NESA, for a little while. We'll come back to him. But it's good to hear that at the end of that last piece, he said that teachers need the support from outside agencies. And from my discussions, a lot of teachers aren't getting that support, or it's being left up to the school who simply can't afford it. Now it's time for one of our brain breaks, just to give your brain a little bit of a chance to relax. And this is a track from the Water Runners, pretty popular from last episode, a band from the Illawarra, and it's their song Jamberoo Mountain.
Pretty little creek. I have to leave home early 6 days a week. When I head down the mountain, it happens every time. I get that lonesome feeling a little further down the line. I get those Jamberoo Mountain, Jamberoo Mountain blues. When I leave home, I get those Jamberoo Mountain blues. Wife, she up and left me, sick of my bad moods. So I'm living on this mountain with nothing left to lose except those Jamberoo Mountain, Jamberoo Mountain blues. When I leave home, I get those Jamberoo Mountain blues. One day I will stop working, spend my time at home, happy on that mountain, and I'll ditch my mobile phone and lose those Jamberoo Mountain, Jamberoo Mountain blues. Yes, I'll stay at home and lose those Jamberoo Mountain blues. Yes, I'll stay at home and lose those Jamberoo Mountain blues.
And that was the Water Runners with their track Jamberoo Mountain. You can get that anywhere you get your music. Now back to Paul Martin, the CEO of NESA. I asked him about tertiary teacher training and how well it was doing its job. I know that some teachers have expressed a great deal of concern about the lack of readiness that teacher trainees have when they first come out.
So teacher education courses are a bit of a whipping boy for various commentators. It's always the fault of, and I'm not suggesting you're in this grouping, Phil, but it's always the case that whenever there is a question mark about or an argument about the quality of teaching, people say fix up the teacher education courses. I think there's been over 100 reviews of teacher education over the last 20 or so years. they generally come back with some similar themes, one of which is teachers need to know how to manage classes better. Then there are also the arguments around do teachers know their content, and can they do have they enough knowledge of their subject discipline? There are ranges of sort of common complaints about teacher education courses. In New South Wales, I think it was under Minister Chadwick, but it was certainly a long time ago now, there was a mandated course unit in teaching students with special needs. It's been a mandated course for a very long time. I think New South Wales may be the first state to introduce it. As well as that, every single method course where teachers are learning how to adjust their lessons appropriately would have a fair amount on dealing with the students with special needs or the range of students in the class. There's about 120, I think, teacher education courses in New South Wales. They vary quite widely, but I think that they've slowly, with the support of NESA and various rules put in by state and federal governments and under their own steam, have become much better than they were 25 years ago. I certainly think a young person coming out with a master's qualification at Macquarie University or one of the other unis would be much better equipped than somebody in 1985 coming out when I did with a one-year dip ed. But it's a hard job, and whatever way you come out as a teacher when you've first graduated, the leap from the practicum or the professional experience to a full-time classroom teacher is quite a significant one. So I understand the point, but I think that we've been getting slowly better, and that when teachers get into teaching and they have proper mentoring and proper supervision and proper support, they become professional reasonably quickly.
However, it's not just the content of university courses that could be the problem. Perhaps it's something else. Perhaps it's the people that are going into our university tertiary courses for teaching. Ronda Delaney's a teacher that pulls no punches. She says it like it is, and she doesn't care about the consequences. And she had this to say. So,
yeah, there was a while there where people could get into university to become teachers on a very low ATAR, and that it's sort of like a slap in the face to people that got into teaching with a higher ATAR. If you get people who aren't very bright or aren't very well educated, you're not going to get your best teachers. So if you attract smart people who want to be there for the right reasons, then you ought to pay them.
And as we've heard from last week, the teaching profession is not well paid, especially compared to other fields of work that a person can go into these days. But smart people aren't going to go to a job where compliance is the only thing that's needed from them. They don't want to be a cog in a wheel. They want to use their motivation skills, their creativity, in order to get the best results. And that is something that perhaps is not required much of teachers these days. Compliance is the key word when it comes to teachers, and compliance is certainly the key word when it comes to their professional development.
I would say that their compliance PD or professional learning has always been there. I mean, child protection legislation or work health and safety or various government legislative requirements are things that teachers have to be kept up to date with in the same way a doctor would or a lawyer would in relation to the expectations and requirements of their profession. We mandate in New South Wales that teachers have to do PD in priority areas, and that relates to curriculum, teaching students with special needs, teaching Aboriginal students, has roles and relationships in terms of assessment, etc. So we then allow teachers to do what they wish to do. In order to maintain their professional accreditation, all we need to know is, have you done it? When did you do it? And what did you think of it? It is certainly bureaucratic, of course it is, but I would hope that it's not onerous, and it's been simplified many, many times. I think there's a lot of PD out there that's not very good. One of the things we do is we evaluate what the teachers evaluate, and we look at what they've evaluated, and we get a sense of it as well. but we think that the teachers themselves are best placed to decide what works and what doesn't, rather than us at NESA. We just define the categories and the areas. And we'll keep getting that. It will keep getting better, I think.
And it's not only the teachers who have to comply. It seems that everyone who rings up NESA and everyone who answers their phone also must comply.
Welcome to the New South Wales Education Standards Authority. Please be advised that all our calls may be recorded for quality, compliance and training purposes.
I hope I complied, and I hope if I'm assessed, my evaluation turns out well. I did ask Paul Martin about assessment and evaluation.
Assessment is probably, we talked about it earlier, the most complex work that teachers have to do, and I would argue at the core of the teaching learning process. And I don't mean sitting marking tests or quizzes or NAPLAN. I mean deep, highly intellectual judgments of student performance mapped to teaching and learning programs and subject content. So a person who's running an assessment program for a whole school is exhibiting significant accomplishment as a teacher, or perhaps even leadership as a teacher. One of the great things about the standards and the work that we're doing, it's opened up these opportunities to talk about the domains and parts of teaching, to allow teachers to have a common language to understand the work they do, and also to be able to say, this is not just standing in front of kids. This is an immensely complex task that requires high intellect, deep knowledge, and utter commitment to students. But it is difficult. There's no one denying that. And like everything in the last couple of years, it's been made more difficult by COVID.
And so we're nearly at the end of our chat with Paul Martin, who believes that assessment is the most complex and at the core of the teaching learning process. I guess that's why the high school certificate has been written by hand for the last, 100 years. I wrote an article for the Sydney Morning Herald in 2011 called Time for the Digital Exam, and it's taken a long time for that message to actually be heard. But it seems sometime soon HSC students will be able to use a laptop or a computer, so that'll be great. Paul Martin, CEO of NESA, thanks for being a guest on Marking the Role.
Absolutely, Phil. It's been a pleasure. And as I said earlier, I couldn't but congratulate the teachers of New South Wales and Australia. They've done an amazing job over the last couple of years.
Yes, they certainly have, and I think they deserve a little bit more money and a little bit less admin work. But anyway, we'll work towards that. We're nearly towards the end, but we're going to round off this episode with a few other comments. But first off, our second brain break with a track by We Mavericks.
Seems she only laughs aloud to drown the doubt. Only wears her clothing tight to keep the cold air out. I think she paints her face to hide the hurt. I know she paints her nails to hide the dirt. You don't lose her to the rattling of the road, the stresses of the overload. She's part of the engine holding it together, and she's working her way undone like a loose screw. So give her some attention, will you, lest you lose her. She's dancing all alone. I think she pulls you in to test your balance I know she pushes back to check her own. A loose screw, watch you don't lose her. Till the rattling of the road, the stresses of the overload, she's part of the engine, holding it together, and she's working her way undone like a loose screw. So give her some attention, will ya, lest you lose her. Stresses of the overload, she's part of the engine, holding it together, and she's working her way undone like a loose screw. So give her some attention, will ya, lest you lose her. She's part of the engine, holding it together, and she's working her way undone like a loose screw. So give her some attention, will you?
And that was Illawarra duo We Mavericks with their track Loose Screw, and you can listen to them wherever you get your music. Now, I had a message from a teacher who was only fairly new to the profession, and she wanted me to read this out because it indicated that new teachers also were having trouble. This is her words. I want administration that respect that teachers know their craft and profession. The freedom to get PD in areas we recognise our weaknesses in, rather than school-wide mandated PD. And that's the end of the quote. And I guess it's really going back to what Paul was saying, that a lot of it is simply compliance. But this teacher wanted to have PD where she needed it, and I think that that's fair enough. I also, via Facebook, received a great message from Melissa Somerville, and this is not her voice, but it is her message.
I am an RFF K6 music teacher since 1998. After taking a few years off for parental leave, I have just returned to the profession in the last 3 years. Upon my return, I was shocked by the increase in workload for general primary teachers. I wholeheartedly agree with the sentiments shared in your podcast about the focus on data collection, which has shifted the emphasis away from developing relationships with the students. It really does break my heart, as I truly believe that effective learning is built upon a solid foundation of friendship and connection. If a teacher is not given the time and space to intentionally develop this with their students, how can we expect students to be open to learning?
And I wanted to finish off this episode really answering a comment that I received during the week from a woman who was very angry at me for even suggesting that students with a disability be excluded in mainstream classes. I didn't actually say that, but I did say that I had an experience with my daughter at my daughter's school, and you'll have to listen back to episode 2 to find out what that was. The truth is, I've dealt with disabled people for a long time. I worked with them full-time for 3 years. And I worked with a marvellous young man called Charlie, who was blind, he was non-verbal, he was autistic, and he had cerebral palsy. I used to work with him once a week for a full day, sometimes twice a week, and we'd do some terrific things. He loved to laugh. He loved to go swimming. He loved to beat the drum when I played the guitar. He loved to ride one of those three-wheeler or four-wheel bikes around Centennial Park and sit there and help drive it along. But I would have hated to see him in a mainstream classroom learning about tessellated shapes. Now, thankfully, his mum opted for a different system because the inclusive way needed the school to adapt to his needs. And she knew that that could never happen, that it could never happen in terms of the content that he needed, that the facilities that he needed, the specialist teachers he needed, and the finances that the school had to give to that. Now, most students with a disability will be just fine in an inclusive mainstream school. But some, like Charlie, need the resources and understanding far beyond what a mainstream school and an overworked, underpaid teacher with 25 plus other students in the class can provide. I hope you've enjoyed episode 3 of Marking the Role. Please tell your colleagues about it. It comes out every Wednesday. The next episode is on behaviour. Yes, the number 2 issue with teachers, ahead of salary, that teachers are being abused, disrespected, and they need it to stop. And I'd love to hear your stories and your experiences of bad behaviour, perhaps the abuse that you've had to tolerate during your career. If you just go to filtered.com.au, that's PHILTERED.com.au, look up Marking the Role there, and you can send me some of the experiences that you might have had. You can also do it via a Facebook text message or a voice message, and also our phone number is on the Facebook page. You've been listening to Marking the Role. My name is Phil Dye. I'll see you next week.